Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So firstly, what are we talking about in policy change? Then we'll do the weighing of where the influence is more important, and then say why the change is actually happening more on our side. So firstly, what are we talking about? We're talking about policy changes. We're talking about changing the police from inside because we wanted to stop shooting black people. We're talking about giving economic subsidies in entering universities to get education even to places where are less rich in our society. In the comparative, we think that the opposition talks about what was in the info slide, which is representation in media and in institution, about, I don't know, cancel culture, canceling people that we think are not okay, and things like that. So firstly, where is the influence that we get, if we get, is more important. So firstly, we think that just intuitively, it's much more important for people not to die in the street because of police brutality than to get better representation in media, right? We think that the right of having actually good life because climate change won't affect us, or safe life, is much more important to people. It is much more prior to other rights of people. And so we think providing it to people is simply more important. If you don't get anything else, it's still the most intuitive thing we have in this debate. But secondly, we think our change is one that it is much harder to replace, right? If you have a new policy, this policy is the law in the government, in the police, in everywhere you find it. And so we think that in opposed to that, Me Too can go away and get cancelled because this is just a culture. This is a cultural thing that right now is prominent. But once we have more people that are more radical, more, I don't know, conservative and things like that, this is something that can shift very easily, because at the end we're talking about human beings, that human beings have thoughts, and thoughts change all the time. In the comparative and in our world, if you have a law, this law is hard to get cancelled. This is something that the government is working by, the police is abiding by, and so it creates better, different policies that is hard to cancel. And so even if we get a change, ours is just easier to maintain. But secondly, we think it simply affects more people, because in your world, you may affect some women that feel more comfortable to go to the police and maybe say, oh, I was harassed sexually, but it doesn't matter because the police itself is misogynistic. It will make you feel better to yourself. And so even if the opposition side gets some change, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't translate to institutions that need to help the people at the end. Even if you feel like you can be accepted to Harvard, it doesn't matter if your socioeconomic state is very, very bad, because the institutions themselves prevent you from doing all of that. And thirdly, partly we would say that our change is simply more probable, right? Because the opposition world, the change is not that probable. You don't know if it will happen, if it not happen. If I have more women representative, that does it mean that women's status will get better? We don't know. Maybe the women will help each other. Maybe they will go against each other because they want to be better. But in our world, we actually get policy. This actually happens and actually helps people at the end. Now, let's understand, right up until now, we told you why our change is better, even if it happens less, even if it happens more, we doesn't care, because at the end, we get better results. But why will our change also happen more? So firstly, and very importantly, we think that when we see that something that is something that needs to be changed by policy, it just convinces much more people. What do we mean by that? When we talk about climate change, when we tell people, listen, you can be affected by that. No matter how rich you are, how privileged you are, you will still be affected by climate change. When we talk about police brutality, people are scared of it getting to them. In Israel right now, we have police brutality. This is for people that go to protest. Maybe I'm not going to protest, but I'm still kind of scared of the police being violent against me, about the police hitting me. And so we think we are just getting much more people that are conservatives also joining the protest and also helping. But secondly, we think that we are facing people with much more probable problems that there are no question whether they are a problem or not. Because we think that when we talk about sociocultural problem, it is much harder for people to say, oh yes, we are all racist. I am racist myself. I don't get black people into my job because I am racist. We don't like to be attacked by the thought that we are racist, we are misogynistic and all of that. But when we are talking about problems that are right now something that we need to fix, about climate change, about police brutality, something that we have stats around, something that we can't just blame the culture, we get people thinking, okay, this is a real problem, we all have to solve it. And so we think that people don't feel attacked, but rather feel like, okay, there is a problem that we need to solve. And here we get just much more commitment of all of the people for the problem. Before I continue, I'll like a POI from closing. Opening.
You call out institutions for not being diverse. Even if you don't know what policies can necessarily change, that institutions are still incentivized to be more diverse, right?
We think that those kinds of policies, the policies that are, for example, diversity, that we can solve by having, for example, policies of affirmative action is also on our side. We are for policies. What we are not for is changing the culture. What changing the culture means? Telling people you are not okay, canceling the culture as a whole. And so we think you on the opposition side have to defend educating people. We in government have to defend changing the world for people to living. Why are we likely to be successful? We think intensity of preferences is on our side. Why? Because we think that we get people that really, really care about one situation. This means that politicians have the incentive to put it on the things that they will do, to know that if they really do these things, people will vote for them based on around those specific issues and agendas. This means that even if I'm some sort of a politician, I know that I will get many angry feminists voting for me if I do this specific thing. It means I have more incentive to do that and to have affirmative action policies, which is a very policy thing that you can change. In the comparative, we think that you see culture and changing socio-cultural things is a very big task and unstoppable task. How do you change all the culture of misogyny? I really don't know. This means that you don't have specific targets. Everything looks like a one big process, one very tiring process. And so we think people are getting exhausted by that, not understanding how can we solve that. But on our side, politicians know they can say to you, the voters, okay, we've done this policy, we tried, now we accept your votes, and they have more incentive to do that. But thirdly, we think that we are just getting much more media attention and good media attention, because in our side, the media is seeing us as someone that solves the problem and changes the government. Here, on the opposition side, media sees us as attackers, people that would want to cancel them as well if they are not abiding by what we want. This means that the media is much more hostile, and so we get worse coverage. We call you to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for the upbench here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Starting your speech. In 3, 2, 1. I agree with OG here. The policy issues are probably really, really important issues. Things like police brutality, things like climate change are really important issues for us to be able to solve. The reasons why they still lose this debate then is that they never prove as why they're able to pass any of these policies at the end of the day. They say that these issues are important. We agree that they are important, but the people on the ground, the people that vote in this politician, the people that provide critical mass for your movement, for example, are very detached from this issue. When you talk about economic redistribution, when you talk about climate change, for example, people generally don't give a fuck. People only care about things that are sensationalized by the media. People usually care about things like canceling other people, media representation, for example. Things are far more proximate and far more grassroots as opposed to complex abstract policy ideas surrounding things like climate change or the criminal justice system. I want to forward two arguments in this speech, both of them integrating with my rebuttals here. The first here is on why sociocultural issues are the necessary prerequisite to gain the critical mass necessary to advocate for policy issues in the long term, and second, on why the progressive movement can counter against right-wing populism through sociocultural issues. We agree with OG when they said that policy issues is the most important issue in this debate. The reason is why we're able to get more effective policy task then is you're able to shift the overturn window, and I'm prudent on within my speech. There are a few reasons for why you're able to gain the sort of critical mass necessary. The first reason is that policy issues are usually very complex and very hard for the common man to be able to understand. Most political parties don't win on policies and a manifesto. Most political parties win on slogans, on rhetoric, and on more proximate issues at hand. They are more sensationalized and often talked about by the mainstream media. The problem with advocating for policy issues then is twofold. The first, that progressive movements' main source of support isn't derived from abstract and relatively complex policies on issues of criminal justice or economic redistribution, but rather on sociocultural ones that are more proximate and well known. Because mainstream media usually talk about these sociocultural issues given the very same reason as well, of the ability to sensationalize and make these issues to be pretty big electoral winning points. The second reason as to why you're likely going to get this sort of critical mass needed here is to pass some degree of policy then, is that these kinds of sociocultural issues are usually things that people can see. People can see when public individuals with problematic backgrounds or problematic statements are cancelled. People can see when you get more racial quotas and affirmative actions in place. People can see when you talk about police brutality and abolishing qualified immunity. People can see when certain people are getting cancelled, for example, as opposed to things like economic redistribution or climate change that you usually require decade-long policy-making, negotiation, filibustering within the legislative chamber. The unique thing about sociocultural issues are that these things usually don't have to go through the same red tape, the same bureaucratic legislative procedure, the same parliamentary discussion over and over again. Because cancelling public individuals or advocating for more media representation can be done organically through things like public pressure as well. The third and the last reason here is that people are usually quite short-termist in nature. We vote out politicians and political parties when they are too slow, when we grow impatient and frustrated with the perceived lack of progress over a certain policy. Which means that even if you are advocating on policy issue, the implementation of these issues are subjected to the very extremely bureaucratic legislative process, and an even longer executive implementation of this legislation means that you run out of steam, you run out of support, you run out of political capital at the end of the day because people don't have faith in you anymore. But I also want to note that usually policy issues are talked about by your already mainstream center-left party, for example. The reasons why progressive movements in and of themselves are so important here is that they're usually advocating for something that is a lot more extreme, something that's a lot more radical, for example. The only way in which you're able to get those sort of radical changes then, or these radical propositions, is to normalize this idea. And then I move on to my comparative here on why there is a comparative here better. Because I want to agree with OG here and concede that you probably do get more far-reaching and sustainable policy and legislation when you advocate for policy issues. But advocating for these things and passing policies for these things are two fundamentally different things. You need to have two things in order for you to pass a policy. The first is the sustainability of the progressive movement to add on to public pressure to things like voter mobilization, critical mass, media, whatever. But the second is that these issues are visibly highlighted, and this is why I view the comparative and why you have more effective advocacy for policy issues long term when you garner this sort of critical mass here. I think there are two reasons for this, but before that, a POI from OG.
Exactly, because people can see cancel culture, people think that there is no problem right now and we are solving it. At this point, we are losing critical amount of people that could afford.
Exactly. Correct. It's the fact that people can see these things and say, oh, we are doing something about it, means that you show yourself to be an effective show of force of the progressive movement. If you can show people that you're doing something or doing shit, for example, you're likely going to get more things to be passed in the future because people have more faith in you, people have more trust in you to do future, more long-term things, for example. But now, moving on to my two reasons here. The first reason is that policy issues are just pretty damn boring. People usually don't listen to the same old white man talking about the same issues and over again with the same elitist lens and out-of-touch, detached lens. The reason as to why media representation is so important here is that you can have far more capacity to highlight issues that used to be considered niche, but extremely important things to solve. So things like systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, white liberalism, for example, are all incredibly niche topics, but do affect a substantial chunk of this enfranchised minority. The reason as to why media representation is so crucial is precisely because the media is an extremely potent and strong force with influence that extends over a large area of audience. In progressive movements, I want to highlight the issues and to shift the overturn window to normalize these perceived radical proposal. The only way to do so is the media constantly bringing up these issues and talking about them. If OG wants to argue that policy issues are good issues, you get more and more people talking about them. You get more and more people that are in support of these progressive policies to address this issue when you have access to the media that's able to dispel far-right boogeymans about these radical proposals. The second year is that the comparative under OG is far worse, because even if you do get to pass policy issues, conservative resistance and public paranoia over radical policies means that you are forced to concede and water down your proposal to one that is considered to be more palatable to the general public, palatable to conservative, for example. This means that contrary to OG, these laws become far easier to replace because you are forced to weaken the safeguards around these laws. That's why Trump is able to opt out of the Paris Accord and the Kyoto Protocol, for example, because these laws are forced to be palatable to conservative forces that don't like these laws. They're likely going to get repealed. But even if these laws are hard to replace, the problem is that laws become far more and more diluted and watered down. The problem with this is twofold. First, you lose on that sort of critical mass. The fact that you're forced to kowtow to conservative forces means people lose faith within progressive movements, perceiving them to be the same out-of-touch moderate elite establishment. So progressive movements lose on their relevance in future issues or future policy issues. We agree that yes, policy brutality is bad and you need good policies to address them. The problem with OG is they never prove neither why would they get these policies passed, nor did they prove as to why these policies can be passed in the first place. The second thing, very quickly on right-wing populism, because I want to know that the far right is getting increasingly more and more powerful because of progressive complacency. The longer we delay representation, the longer we don't hold people like Santiago Abascal or Marine Le Pen, Netanyahu accountable for the violent shit that they say, means that you allow them to continue garnering more and more influence and sway over the rest of society when you don't dispel these things, when you don't call them out for it. The reason as to why you need to counter them right now is that populism is a very potent force that allows people to have access to. Populist rhetoric are usually in line with sociocultural issues because people can see these things, people can talk about these things. That's why you get more media representation to call out far-right bullshit on the outside of the house. That's why we get progressive policies passed. For all those reasons, very propose.
I'd like to thank the leader of that fine speech and call upon the DPM. You're here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, and I would like to begin my speech by engaging against side opposition on the mechanisms of why policy is boring and nobody is ever going to buy it. Number one, they tell you that policy is complex so people can't understand it. That's just a fucking lie. We will give you more money. We will save you from dying in climate change. We will stop police murdering people. Very easy, and note also very sensationalized, which is the second part of the mechanism. More money, saving you from dying, all of that very sensationalized, very slogany, very easily to pass. No clue why that's impossible to people. Secondly, it's the fact that policy passes and saying people just can't see and notice this policy. No, people are poor. People see that summers are getting hotter and hotter. People see videos on police brutality in the media all of the time. People can absolutely see welfare being given to them, money being given to them. The public education system improved, better teachers, more programs for their kids. They can absolutely see more infrastructure built in their towns. They can absolutely see in the media more oil pipelines closed down, regulations of pollution, and police being put down from all of that. No clue. Then they tell you police are short-termists. Policy, people are short-termist and you can't just pass policy in the short term, which is also very, very, very weird, right? Because parliaments pass laws all of the fucking time within the time span of one election. If that was possible, then no ruling party could ever govern. It is absolutely possible within the span of one term to pass multiple policies. Just look at any single government in the world. It is just assertive that it is impossible to do that. Well, Biden does a lot of policies and reform, build back better, fight against climate change, all of that. Well, parties constantly do that today. But lastly, they talk to you, we have parties who are talking about the policy today. Obviously, the question is how much people put in and check, how much people get convinced by that, how much people move in, and how much how much do these parties actually pass this policy and don't talk about it, which is what we're actually doing. Note at that point that the last point of we want to curb far-right populism is entirely dependent on the fact that the only way to curb them is about doing culture war, right? Which we tell you isn't the thing. You call them out, but you call them out as policy now. On the fact that Netanyahu isn't doing shit to help the people in Israel under a current economic crisis, he isn't doing shit to stop the crime wave that he has promised to stop. He isn't doing shit on any of the policy proposals because all he's doing is far-right populism, trying to turn Israel into a dictatorship. That's how you effectively call them and break out the ecological bubble, as I will soon prove to you. Let's talk to you about number of supporters. Note here, number one, about how do we get the median voter in the middle. Yael already explains to you. Number one, the fact that policy is actually important to them. They are oftentimes poor. They oftentimes need money. You can tell them, look, you're poor, you need money. We're going to give that to you directly. You can sensationalize it. You can pass it through the media. You can do it talking it. You can do interesting debates, right? The fact like Anna Kasparian going into debates online and sensationalizing all of that stuff, or debate streamers Vosh Destiny going in and they're trying to do sensational meme content in order to push policy through and arguing in policy against conservatives and making it very interesting on how they bank conservatives. That is all policy, but being passed. But in order to in an entertaining way, But in order to convince someone, you just need to convince them first and foremost that your objectives are good for them. You need to convince that, and specifically as the opening opposition, these policies are good, these policies are popular, most people want them, they want money, they want climate change to be stopped and not die. On the comparative, it is hard for the average swing voter to understand why canceling a company is good for them. Note here, more representation, canceling a company might help some people, but these are people that are usually just not from the demographic of the swing voter, because if you're from an ethnic minority or probably progressive already, the swing voter is usually white or usually unconnected to the effect of canceling a company and all of that. But on the second point, it's the fact that usually just canceling a company or canceling a person just doesn't help you directly. It might help other people from your demography. The company might become more representative and hire other people, but it doesn't help you. Comparatively, policy actually helps you directly, and therefore you are far more likely to be convinced from that when you're told, we're going to give you money, we're going to solve climate change, we're not going to let police fight you over, all of that. Secondly, it's about distance. The fact that when you cancel all of these figures, it is actually distasteful for you. It is actually you don't want to you like all of the figures that are being cancelled oftentimes. You like the fact that you like all of the popular media, these companies that are providing services to you and all of that. So you actually gain distasteful when you see the left cancelling people, when you see your cultural icons being cancelled and stuff like that. You're actually likely to backlash against the movement where he will solve that because you aren't cancelled. Lastly, on media representation. OG tells you media representation is crucial. Note, this motion isn't about actually getting to media, it's about a progressive movement trying to get into media. But we tell you, we get to media better on our side. Why is that? Because media is uniquely susceptible to being cancelled. Note, media personalities are very public, right? They're always on the limelight, so there's a huge interest in checking them and cancelling them and all of that because they're very public, you know them, you oftentimes won't cancel. And secondly, they have a lot of baggage. They have like 20, 30 years, oftentimes more, of being on air, of their cultural norms shaking. Oftentimes, their media personalities are being caught over like old claims that they have been. This means that specifically the media and media personalities oftentimes backlash against wokeness, right? Even CNN doesn't like the hyper woke and oftentimes talks about gas and culture and all of that. Uniquely on our side, when it's about policy, we are far more likely to draw them through because then they are too susceptible of risk. Note here, CNN, MSNBC are networks focused on policy, not around cancelability, and are far more likely to be amicable to you when you aren't canceling these people directly, when you aren't fighting over Cuomo and all of their anchors directly on media. Therefore, we get far more people. So we'll continue. The CEO have like literally anything to engage with, like anything, POI. I'm not sure how you can tackle the CEO like availability to between the POI.
Yeah, sorry, CEO has a point.
Okay, sure.
Don't you think that the actual problems are people that are from people suffering on the ground, such as sexism in companies, such as racism in schools? Those are the things that can actually be solved on our side of the house.
So I think that the way to solve them is through institutional policy, right? Yael already says that to the extent that he wants to solve sexism in companies, you pass laws which actually do systemic change. To the extent that you want to solve stuff in schools, you pass policy schools. We think that on the ground people are also starving, also climate change is killing them, also victims of police brutality, all of that we get on our side. Okay, so let's talk to you lastly about policy. Note here the weighing which all concedes to. Even if we get less people, then the fact that we can pass more policy with these people is still more important because our policy is more important. Here, note that there are still people who are already left-wing sometimes, right? A lot of countries in Europe are objectively controlled. Joe Biden is controlled, so we can just claim that we don't get any policy. But the question here is smoke screening. No, passing leftist policy is hard. You have capital and like a lobbyist working on you. You're working within coalition with more moderate elements. You have procedural resistance of like Supreme Court and bureaucrats working against you. The important thing here is that this motion gives them an out of culture warring, and out of going into media and talking about Disney, about Dr. Seuss, about and culture warring themselves in order to get votes. It doesn't put scrutiny on them. When we get the voters far more focused on policy, on what they're actually doing, when we publish policy reports and push them more in the media, when we get more of an ability to put scrutiny on them through primary groups, when the voters focus far more on putting in politicians in check, they actually pass policy instead of just culture warring and getting that all of that and just removing that. We solve the smoke screen problem. We actually get them to push the policy through, and therefore, note, since every single welfare reform matters for like 100 cancellations in terms of actually have on people, us just doing it some of the time matters far more than opposition getting maybe more people, but not actually passing in meaningful policy with them. Very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the DPM for that fine speech and call upon the DLO here.
Right.
Need more water, sorry. Starting my speech. Oh yeah, POIs in chat, I'll try to take one before 6. Just, yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. A few engagements to aside, OG, before I begin with my extension of my LO speech, right? First, on the idea that inherently these signalings of cultures do not inherently change institutes and have no capability of effecting change. I want to note here, the systems of change are inherently parallel on both sides, right? The way in which the common people get change on the very top levels of government within the parliament itself isn't for voting for bills, voting for propositions within the parliament. You do not directly engage democracy within that ways, right? The ways in which you signal to a democratic institute what exactly is it that you want out of these policies and the end goal of these policies is the way that you get detailed policies, right? Because understand that you as the average reasonable voter, as the average intelligent voter, does not have the capacity or the understanding to go over what policies are going to be the least damaging and most beneficial towards the movements that you necessarily want, right? More on that later on how this fragments movements. But first, let's talk about like their OG's accusations that, hey, we settle smoke screen issues that ultimately do not impact people. Just want to really quickly point out that things such as institutional representation and all of these various cultural issues are still issues that are extremely proximate to individuals, right? There's no particular reason why exactly is it that your average climate change issue is more urgent than the fact that you are getting racially harassed on the street almost every single day, right? Some issues are problems of cultural norm, and these are necessarily also on the same levels of urgency. I don't think that you can necessarily say that, right? If any, you can actually weigh it like that. If anything, I would say that these cultural issues weigh even more in that in scales of urgency because of the fact that it affects you on your daily life and in every single way, and also affects huge life-changing decisions, right? Such as which colleges that you get into, i.e., if you're more likely to help encourage changes with in encouraging diversity within college campuses and encouraging affirmative action, if you're going to focus on social cultural change under our side. I don't see it's a false dichotomy that OG sells you. Don't buy into it, right? But second, I want to talk about how policy change happens easier here, because understand that what DLO has proposed of hey, you can support wide ideas of how to change society without having to support little levels of how policy enacts. I think that's inherently contradictory, right? Because note that when there is outrage about Michael Bay making pro-military movies or companies not hiring LGBTQ plus people, the outrage comes from a genuine support of certain ideals that at the end of the day impact society within the same ways, right? It is against military expansion, it is against LGBTQ plus discrimination. That inherently signals to lawmakers that we want more LGBTQ protection laws, we want to cut back on military spending, and we want people to stop being dicks to each other in society. That is the level of proportional representation that is important within society nowadays. Because if you want to argue specifically how we're going to solve climate change, I think you get varying levels of responses and not get unity. On what my extension is about today, right? I want to argue two things. First thing on access and galvanization. Second thing on unity, right? Before I move on, I'll take a CGPOI.
Guys, the world is not liberal. Most people hate immigrants and are very conservative. Why do you think there is going to be no backlash towards massive social change?
I think that it's going to be worse on your side, because if you have solid policy pushes, that's the point in time people are going to be like, oh, they're trying to take over our laws and change specific systems. If you want to run backlash, it happens on the same sides, because progressive movements are going to be actively advocating at the same level of activity regardless, right? Yeah. First, on the idea of access, right? I think people are just unlikely going to understand policy, right? Because even if they do understand policy, they're going to do it in the way DLO puts it, right? A very surface level understanding of policy that at the end of the day doesn't matter, because the individuals who are likely going to debate policy, implement policy, are individuals who have a larger understanding of law and probably more financial and other reasons to care about these kind of things, right? Meaning that whatever signals that you want to do on the surface level is incredibly shallow and probably realistically does not consider the factors of many other individuals on the ground, right? I.e., if you care about climate change, you're also probably not going to care about the jobs and livelihoods of co-workers and other alternative industries that exist that rely on climate change, and you necessarily cause damage to those communities. But second, you are likely also at that point in time fracture on what the you also like at that point in time feel distance away from how to engage the movement, right? Because necessarily policy change only happens on the very top levels of society, right? You are realistically incapable of writing good levels of policy to advocate towards people and not know how to argue them properly, right? Why is it that access to social activism is important? Because people can participate in social media campaigns, etc., a bit easier, and at that point in time they feel more involved within the movement, and at that point in time they signal to larger society what necessarily these changes are, right? Broad cultural social stances alter alter significantly the Overton window in which individuals process and understand where society stands on certain issues. And at that point in time, individuals on our side are better galvanized because they feel better involved within these movements at the end of the day. Second, on on fractioning the movement, right? And I want to point out this very clearly, right? When they say that they want to solve climate change, there are larger questions onto how exactly to solve climate change, right? Is atomic energy considered renewable energy? Should people try to like pressure, like preserve the current world as it is, or should we look towards like post climate change world? How do we necessarily shift from fossil fuel energy to clean energy, and how do we store all the excess electricity? All of these are issues that like necessarily the average reasonable voter A cannot particularly understand. No, thank you, I've taken one already. But second, that individuals' largest but people don't necessarily need to understand, right? People's largest sentiments on like saying that, hey, we want climate change legislation now, or rather when people see that like there is significant outrage towards like, you know, Taylor Swift's carbon emissions or individual carbon emissions by certain companies, that's the point in time where the government or elected officials are likely to A, jump on the bandwagon, or B, if they're currently within or if they're running for election, running during election year, make election promises to ensure that these things changes happen, right? If the policies are received positively, that's the point at which individuals are likely if the policies are received properly, that's the point at which positively, that's the point at which politicians and the existing political structures within the world is going to likely continuously support your sentiments in society, right? Last extension, right, on the idea of relatability and being unique agents, right? As Raymond has already put it, I think that on the very large scale of things, the urgency of these issues is well known. I have no reason to see why exactly social policy does not relate with cultural, with that policy does not relate with the social cultural issues, right? Because necessarily saying that a lot of issues on social discrimination can also be solved by legislation to a very large extent. At that point in time, I want to note that even like you cannot package things as policy because these issues are more likely digestible as individual issues that individualized people experience every single day, as individuals fuck-ups that you can point out to and call out, right? At that point in time where you point out the incremental changes that you want to make towards society, it's the point at which individuals understand where to target policy and politicians get to understand what exactly what wants to create, right? And I want to note here that also dealing with the idea of like cultures necessarily shift over time, that there is a large growing sentiment of anti-progressivism and like pro-outright movements within the current political sphere. At this point in time, it is even more necessary for these social cultural like nuances to be introduced within the world by these progressive movements. And at that point in time, we serve as counter-narrative for what otherwise would be a disastrous outcome for our existence. With that, I rest my case.
Like the DL of that point speech and all speakers in the top half of our great debate so far. I invite the member of government to extend the case for the prop bench now. You're here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. Give me 10 seconds to set up my timer. Παναγis αυτό. Okay. Wait. I must speech. 3, 2, 1. I think opening opposition is kind of confused, right? And they also kind of like self-backstab themselves. They have huge tensions. Notice at the very least of the DLO, they're trying to frame that there is alternative society proposition because it is very digestible for people in order to be able to grasp and understand why policy is easier to be passed and it's easier to correct the mistakes. But notice at the beginning of DLO, they frame exactly the opposite, right? They say, oh, it's too much of a pressure mechanism. It's too much of a change in order to be digestible. And like the proximity of social social cultural change is easier for people because they have less urgency, because they understand better. I think they cannot pick and choose what they want to run. They have to choose either it's harder for them or like to pass policy, and it's easier for them to pass social economic like policies, than for them to have more urgency, right? I think they concede two major things in opening opposition. One, there is less urgency when it comes to social economic issues, exactly because it's more proximate to people. Notice they never analyze how people are proximate to it, right? They say, oh, it's too much of a scale of a change, but they don't explain the intensity of the change. This is something we're going to characterize on CG. So the first extension is how people are proximate with this stuff and why it is polarizing and like classing directly with opening up. But the second thing they actually concede is that there is a tendency towards conservatism being pushed harder, right? And so the second extension is the following. We're incontingent on the efficient class, right? Opening half is about who has better legislation. We're more about how the agenda is set and what's been discussed and why discussing about policy is way better, like beneficial for us at the House. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Three pieces of framing. One, why we have more progressive than more conservative than progressive. One, overall has considered already, but two, like just throw out some mechanisms. I think the religion, family, self-biases about how you perceive world, like proximity of like having Euroscepticism and like going anti-globalization like agendas and stuff like that, make people become more progressive and more conservative. Exactly because you also have like this kind of polarizing agenda that is pushed higher through EU or like the US. But two, I think the universality of the movement is also critical here. That, like opening half is missing out, right? How the progressives and who are the progressives? Notice that this analysis prerequisite when it comes to analyzing efficiency, right? We think two things. One, progressives are not only movements, but are also parties or like celebrities and stuff like that have this kind of visibility. Like they have close ties. Like AOC should be considered part of the progressive movement, right? But two, I think also the people that are more likely to be involved are the hardcore ones, the ones that will heavily prioritize the movement in order to be as vocal as possible. This looks like sacrificing your job or like sacrificing your education, like Greta Thunberg, in order to be on the front line, right? This means that you create more capital, and this means that you are more vocal and you're able to actually like sway more people and create more chaos and more sound in order to be able to be visible and to be heard, right? Why this analysis is important? Because you have to compare and contrast the hardcores that are discussing about socioeconomic agendas and the hardcores that are discussing about the climate and like policy agenda. I think there is a critical difference there of who is able to actually adjust the conversation better. Why? Inherently, if you overwhelmingly focus on identity politics, things go to hell, and why like conservatives will always win this kind of class. We think like it has already been established why progressive movements have enough of an agenda-setting power. Notice, we're not claiming that they have the ability to shape preferences as opening half. We don't say that they have the fiat to sway people to be single-issue voters. We're claiming that there is through social media, through agendas, celebrities, political parties, and stuff like that, you have the ability to settle what is being discussed, right? Notice again that like it doesn't matter when it comes to how much of the change you're pushing forward. It doesn't matter the scale of the change that you're asking for, but matters of the intensity of the change that you're asking for, right? So you will always brag and negotiate like 10%, but you will always like get 5 or 2 or 3. And you're gonna be pretty justified and you're gonna be pretty okay with it, right? Why? The polarization is gonna be hardcore and personalized. I think people have this kind of self-fulfilling biases and subconscious bias. They're proximate and they're linked to their own culture and their own like identification of the world, right? In order to be able to pass policy when it comes to socio-economic, societal like agendas, you have to address yourself and you have to fight yourself in order to rationalize that are a part of the problem, right? It's entirely different to blame the system that has been like outdated and that has not been able to pass policy efficiently on climate change. And it's entirely different to conceive yourself as a racist person in order to be able to understand why quotas are necessary and why you have subconscious bias. The threshold therefore for competing incentives is way higher on the opposition side because you are the ones that has to be blamed for the society to change, right? But two, I think the discussion is becoming way more heated. The moment that you are self-involved and the moment as OO concedes, you are more proximate and you have more opinions on it and you think that you know better, is the moment that you're actually declining the discussion and you're not engaged in the discussion productively, right? So you think, oh, I know that Kevin Spacey is innocent because I have this self-bias that like House of Cards was great and I'm not going to engage the discussion. I think I'm a white supremacist, but I think I'm like more liberal to people of color. Therefore, I'm not buying that quotas are necessary because I think all people that are white are actually voting liberally, right? I think all of these problems are exactly because why you self-gaslight that you're actually not a part of the problem, but you're a part of the solution, but you don't understand that you're actually part of the problem, which is harder from, right? Why all of this is beneficial? Before I go on, opening up, save your case.
Tell me why is it worthwhile for a social movement to tell its members to wait for 10 years for a policy that may or may not work instead of tackling the issues that they face daily in a space they can have access to any time?
Okay, one, I have to explain that we're heavily focusing on what is inherently problematic with the agenda and what's inherently problematic with the policy. I don't have to prove to you why they're going to be convinced that they have to sway their opinion, but they're going to be better informed, they're going to be more aware when it comes to what is the structural problem and what is the inherent harm that this policy has. There is more likelihood to be informed, right? Because of conscious biases and because you see them and they trend and stuff like that. One, I think microaggressions happen way more frequent on side opposition, exactly because you're getting more personalized and things get more heated. Or with echo chambers, you have more hate crimes. You see more like colored people as a threat to you too. I think this kind of polarization agenda is something that sticks in your mind because you're not able to pass it through. But three, I think on us of the house, the information is actually being able to force accountability, right? And notice this is, I think, a smart framing, Panagis, right? One, it's not necessarily that we're going to pass progressive policies, but it's a prerequisite that we're going to deter for more like conservative policies, right? Because it's entirely different to shift like heavily the agenda towards Trump not passing any more conservative policy, like being able to hold accountability when it comes to Supreme Court decisions and stuff like that, rather than focusing on Tucker Carlson and actually him being extremely racist, right? It's entirely different discussion, and you have different outcomes. That's why if you're gonna be like relevant, because I think this is where opening half is losing the debate, you're gonna be relevant once in a million time as a movement, right? You're gonna have this kind of capital and all like modes will align in order for you to be able to be extremely relevant. If this one time you're gonna be relevant, you want to be on the right path of victory in order to actually make change and to make people be better informed about accountability and about where they're actually living. Proud to propose the motion. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible and visible? Hello? Aha, okay. Okay. Power resides where people believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall, and a very small movement can create a very large shadow. Our extension is going to be very simple. We won't rely on policy change. We won't rely on achieving critical mass. What we're saying is that movements, just with a few hundred activists, can achieve massive impacts on the ground, right? Doing illegal action, giving anti-abortion pills to women who cannot do it otherwise. Stop creating watch groups, boycotting certain celebrities, deplatforming on universities. Those are all of the things that movements can do that create actual change to people, and they don't need critical mass. They don't need to create certain policy which is fickle and that is opening is out of debate. So that is how we differentiate immediately from opening opposition. They claim this will create critical mass, then how do you say change in the future? We don't think that's certain. We will outframe it, and our arguments won't be contingent there. Thankfully, the CG, how do you say, are only people who actually know what is reality, and that is the more people are becoming more conservative. The first reason is because they don't like a lot of the policies that the progressive are doing, such as migration, such as, how do you say, climate change, which causes huge unemployment to the vast majority of people. They only care about now. They only care about their children, not necessarily to the planet in 50 years. Secondly, a lot of younger people are anti-establishment, and the establishment in Europe, in which is the
Hi, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but the chair has dropped out, so you would need to probably repeat your speech. We'll wait for them for a minute. So sorry.
Okay. Anticlimactic. Sorry, so do we just wait for the chair, and is this legitimate? I don't want to be scammed.
Yeah. We have to wait for the chair to join. I think they've joined.
Can they confirm?
Did the chair miss any part of MG's speech?
Hi there. Yeah, no, sorry. Conveniently, my internet decided to crash right at the end of the MG, so I got everything from the MG, and then it decided to die. So don't worry about that. Apologies, everyone, for that delay. I'd like to thank the member of government for that fine speech. Yada yada yada. Welcome, member of opposition, to extend the case for the odd bench.
Thank you. Am I audible? Please.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Power resides where people believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall. And a very small movement can create a very large shadow. What we, from closing opposition, want to say is that these movements can create a lot of benefits, a lot of good things to the people on the ground just by boycotting, just by doing illegal actions such as giving birth control pills to women who don't have access to it, such as deplatforming people who are misogynistic and stuff like that, such as boycotting companies. These are things that companies, that these movements can do with just a couple hundred activists. And all of these things create actual benefits for people on the ground. Notice, our analysis is not contingent on you achieving policies or gaining critical mass. We think that these things that Top Hat is saying are flimsy, and we'll try to outframe it for a bit. A couple of points of framing before I get into argumentation. We agree, firstly, that with closing comment, that more people are becoming more conservative. One, they don't like the policy, such as migration. They are excessively against migration. Two, climate change is causing recessions, causing unemployments and stuff like that in most situations, and people are against it. They would rather prioritize their children over the planet in 60 years when they would be dead otherwise. Two, a lot of younger people are anti-establishment. In a majority of countries in Europe, the establishment is progressive, pro-EU and stuff like that, meaning they default to the other side, opposition, which is, how do you say, right-wing parties and stuff like that. Thirdly, a lot of people believe that woke culture has just gone too far and they are becoming seriously against it and stuff like that. The example of this are all over the place in Europe, such as Sweden, Italy, France. All of these countries have huge right-wing parties that either took control or to have 40% in the parliament. This means that it is incredibly flimsy, how do you say, that we actually achieve some policy change and stuff like that. Secondly, we just want to say that a lot of left politicians already vouch for policy. You don't need movements. They already had huge platforms to say, we want, how to say, higher taxes and stuff like that. We don't need movements, right? So we are not clear on how to actually achieve political policy change, but my partner will destroy it further. The main extension is the following. Prioritizing socio-cultural issues are giving concrete benefits to people on the ground. We say these are broadly five things. These are canceling figures who are actively misogynistic, who are actively denying women the right to abortion, who have a history of groping women in the workplace, sexually abusing them, awful behavior, canceling them. Two, this is boycotting certain companies for their awful behavior, not buying their products, boycotting them on Twitter, using hashtags, creating a perception that they are awful. Thirdly, this is creating watch groups, armed watch groups that are here to stop police brutality on the ground. This is something that is happening in America. Black Lives Matter, some of these groups are armed and ready to stop police brutality. Or even if they don't shoot them, they are recording. They are there to record and to post it online so they create some form of change. Fourthly, this is illegally providing help to a lot of minorities, such as giving birth control pills to women where otherwise they don't have it. This is giving condoms to them. This is giving creating, how do you say, other social networks to actually help them. Fifthly, this is, at the end of the day, protesting on the street, boycotting certain things so you can actually achieve change the old-fashioned way that is always being done, blocking certain bridges, blocking entrances, throwing eggs at certain company CEOs, right? These are the things that we are supporting. These are the things that these are effective. And this is a crucial thing that you need to notice, right? For all of these things, you don't need a critical mass. You don't need millions of people to actually do these things. You need a couple of hundred, how do you say, activists that will actually create a huge shadow on the wall and actually achieve some change, right? And this is the crucial thing. This is how we are, how do you say, not contingent on any, how do you say, clash that was in the opening half, whether or not people are joining these movements or not. We don't care. It is hard to prove, right? This is why we are doing something like this. Before I get into impacts, and there are a lot of impacts, I actually will completely bombard the other teams. I will take point from OG.
we get more things on the ground because the majority opposing them, the media opposing them, private capital opposing them, and now going to get traction and just get laughed at as radical.
You're not, but the thing is, you're not getting a lot of things on the ground. You're vouching for higher taxes. You're vouching, how do you say, you cannot scroll the motion. You cannot vouch for anything. The motion says at the expense of. You cannot say, this, that, everything is ours. No, higher taxes, certain CO2 emissions are capped and stuff like that. These are, how do you say, to change the behavior of certain police commanders. These are the things you're vouching for, but it's not clear that you will actually get this. You need political change to go to the parliament. We don't think that's even likely at the end of the day, especially if it's effective. There's something else you need to prove. What are the impacts of things we are saying? There are several. Firstly, it's like we already mentioned, direct help to people on the ground. People are suffering on the ground. They won't take solace in the parliament voting for, how do you say, cutting CO2 emissions. No, you need help. They need money. They need, how do you say, certain help so their crops will not die immediately from climate change. They need help immediately, or abortion pills and stuff like that. Secondly, how do you say, these minorities can boycott colleges. They can stop the functioning of certain bridges, of certain companies, of certain colleges, and they can demand change. They can demand, if you don't deplatform this person, we won't move. And that is how you achieve a lot of change, right? But thirdly, using social media creates the perception that there are a lot more people actually in this movement and are actually vouching for this, right? You can just hashtag something. You can post various posts, sponsor it, and it's easy to get the people going, to talk about this, to be polarized, and for that machinery to go again and again. And why does this matter, right? Because now that you achieve certain, how do you say, these smaller people are casting, how do you say, a large perception that this is something huge. This slowly also changes how people behave. This means that even that now certain people who had unconscious sexist behavior, not groping, but catcalling them, being a little, how do you say, down, a little bit bad to them, right? They're now ashamed. They're constantly thinking about this. Wait, if I do this, I will be ashamed, and people can call me out on Twitter, and I can be canceled. And this is much worse for me, especially in companies that are much more scared. But also, the final thing I want to say, it's better for victims right now when movements do this, because victims now have a platform which they can say what is bugging them their whole life. Finally, a light in the dark, right? If you're only vouching for policy change, you don't have a Twitter safe space where you can say #MeToo, this person has sexually harassed me. You feel scared, but now you have that platform finally. All of this, how do you say, a plethora, an array of all of these different things are something that is lost on government side. And these are the things that are most important, especially when policy is not only flimsy, but not effective in a sense. Thank you.
I'd like to thank a member opposition back by speech and call upon the government whip to conclude the case for the proposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. In CG, we're not relying on proving by. Society is enough already conservative. And panel, this debate is not in a liberal bubble of debate. Like, let's even assume the best case side for opening opposition in CO. Like, they have to prove their case can only work, for example, in Western Europe and the US. We tell you that most countries are highly conservative, especially when it comes to social matters and not policy matters. And that is a tipping point where you directly aggravate society against you, where you increase polarization of society, where there are going to be more hate crimes against the progressive movement and against minorities. We find that impact immense and irreversible and not linked to any buying legislation or any buying that exists in opening opposition or opening government, because most likely you're not going to achieve change for many structural reasons we're going to keep in this speech. Okay, rebuilding. So they never attacked our case in any way in CO. They just provided more concessions that helps our case more, but they also ran a smart case and will explain why later it doesn't work. Right, because CO considered that there is more people are becoming more conservative because of woke culture and because wokeness is going too far. Guys, this is a status quo because actually left-wing parties are pushing for more woke policy, for more, not woke policy, for more woke rhetoric specifically. It's not conservatives in the US are like, fuck Biden because of the climate change law. It's fuck Biden for arguing about quotas in universities, and fuck Biden about arguing about but specific things that have to do with my evangelical Christian beliefs and abortion. We think that to the point that the environmental movement pushes, the progressive movement pushes this way more, you increase this polarization way more, like it is happening in the status quo, and we want to avoid that. Our impact is this. 3 things. 1, you have an increase of hate crimes because people can correlate and personalize more to the message, as OO said. This means that there are direct impacts to minority populations that do not have to do with pushing legislation or having fake change like cancel culture will explain later. But secondly, you have more accountability. Panel, notice it is easier to not pass policy than to pass policy. It is easier for a Senate to, for example, block a bill than to pass a bill because it requires less buying for the population, but also the politicians themselves. Therefore, accountability means that less people are harmed to the point that you talk about the specific policy. If we say that Trump is fucking up because of this specific policy of immigration, not because he's just racist, then we're much more likely to stop a politician from doing this. But thirdly, there is less noise and polarization in society because you do not focus on the identity part or the cultural part of the society, and you focus more on the policy part, which is something that more people are going to agree on, specifically because they do not link themselves as opening opposition considered. Okay, going to opening government. Opening government is relying on pushing change. I think that if they achieve their case is good. We still beat them because our case is a prerequisite, they will still prove that. But 2 things. 1, why policy is uncertain if it passes? 3 reasons. 1, there are structural barriers like the Supreme Court, which is inherently more conservative than progressive because it focuses on not passing policy than passing policy. Secondly, there is direct interest of capital to not push legislation for climate change and to not push legislation for progressive movement. This means that even if you have buy-in, it does not mean you to pass it. But thirdly, budgets fluctuate and maybe you pass something, it will be cut later on. So passing policy is not the tipping point to winning this debate because it is not necessary that you get the benefits of passing policy. Why are cases a prerequisite to opening government? Because you need to create the proper information to the public and less polarization, force policy to be advocated and work. This and also like not pass bad policies, have to revert later on and use more capital to revoke. This means that we're better able to provide said policy outcomes that OG wants. If public is less against the progressive movement because they do not consider them like people that want to entirely change their social backgrounds and consider them the villain, then they're much more likely to advocate for climate change and push for climate change, which means that we co-opt all these benefits. And 2 things. 1, even if we don't do that, the benefit of hate, the harm of hate crimes is irreversible and massively intense. Legislation is uncertain if it passes, and therefore, just for that, we beat OG. Going to OO. OO case, all of OO's cases that they matter down, they require more buying and proving that they're moving successful. Many reasons why that's not the case. 1, buying from whom? They never specified. I don't know how conservatives would consider it a good thing that you now cancel Kevin Spacey or that you cancel Tucker Carlson. At the end of the day, the people they buy in are already in the movement. Therefore, the delta is very small. Secondly, urgency to whom? We do not consider the vast majority of society considers like quotas in universities an urgent thing. It is most likely a very woke part of the majority and the minority itself that is harmed, which is also already part of the movement, so it doesn't apply. But lastly, what is considered successful or not is very reliant on the person that is subjecting themselves into it. If a proven society is more conservative, which DLO considered and CO considered, then it is much more likely that it will not consider successful. But lastly, we flip this. We tell you that if people feel more threatened because they see more bad things happening, like more people being cancelled, or more of the stars being like cancelled and that stuff, they're much more likely to act in a very negative manner. Lastly, on fractionalization of the movement, that's massively symmetric because they can fractionalize on whether Kevin Spacey is a rapist or not, or whether they should cancel that person. Like it's independent of points. Okay. Lastly, going to CEO, but before that, OO.
The problem on your side of the house is that you can always talk about policy, but the reach you have as a progressive movement towards talking about this issue is severely limited where you don't have access to the media. It's only on our side of the house where you normalize these things.
Yeah,
and make
sure.
sure that these
Okay,
sure.
Even if we concede this harms OG. This does not respond to closing government case because at the best case scenario, at the worst case scenario for us, nothing passes, but there are less hate crimes and less active harm towards the movement. Okay, going to CO. CO's case for it to work does not apply to the motion. because you can have a small brigade of people punching stuff, even if you do not heavily prioritize, because it's just a part of the movement. But three things why we can flip their case. One, heavily prioritizing things like climate change or immigration means that people are likely to policy for that, means that they are likely to do what OCO says, to go out and punch factories, to go out and help people in the streets. But secondly, their advocacy, they never did the comparative on their side of the house. They never explained why advocating to cancel Kevin Spacey means more people go out to protect victims of sexual harassment. Because you're much more likely to find this as an individual problem than a systemic problem, and therefore there are less victims out there for you to help. But lastly, that even if their case works, and they've proven all of this that only works social, their case is easily stopped by police, by just having police take this bunch of bandits or some other punching cars and prevent them from doing this. Our case does not work like that because it is not an organized part that is doing those hate crimes or is polarized. It's a big part of society that is conservative, and therefore we don't want them to piss them off. For all of the above reasons, vote CG.
I'd like to thank the government for that fine speech, and lastly call upon the opposition whip to conclude the debate here.
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with the opening opposition is that they basically debate is a little with opening government is the debate is a little bit in a bubble. Like these movements are the most important thing in politics, and these movements make the most change. I don't think that's realistic. I think these movements have a good amount of support, but they're not strong with their politicians. They're not strong with their parties. Why is this important? Notice that parties, especially left-wing parties, have a huge incentive to do all of these things and to advocate for policies. Why? This is something that attracts people. People want to hear, I'm going to do something. Secondly, it is expected. People expect politicians to have specific policy that they're going to do. Thirdly, it's easier to remember, especially in states when you have multiple parties. It's easier to remember if you're giving specific specific policies. Fourthly, it's usually only thing that they have against the conservative parties for their supporters to have more liberal politics, but also for all of the reasons that the opening government gives you itself. The visibility of people accepting this is something that politicians on a left wing use to actually gain points in being power. So the easier it is, it's more likely that politicians are doing this anyway. Notice what's really important here, that the political parties have disproportionately more power than the movements itself. Why? They have enormous amount of money. They have enormous amount of lobbies. They have enormous access to media, etc. So it's extremely unlikely that now progressive movements are going to change this, something that the parties are already doing and either getting or not getting. We're not going to discuss how much they get those policies, but we think that that's already saturated. They're not getting that much of it. No policy was completely supported by a left-wing party and had no effect. But when the movement joined, now people are all accepting it, and everything is changing. Notice also that it's generally hard to influence what policies are being implemented because of the huge amount of capital and lobbying and all of these things. The policies are extremely difficult to be affected by the people on itself. For all these reasons, I think that their case is not that probable to work. But also they say that laws are hard to change, and this is really good. No, I completely disagree. Laws are laws are extremely easier to change. Laws can be changed in second minute when the other party wins. Laws are not something that a legislature is not something that's that much stable. Okay, what does CG tell us? CG tells us that we have enormous amount, now people are completely going to backlash at something. First of all, just to clarify something, my partner tells you right-wing is on the rise, but we're not saying that right-wing is 70% or 80%. It's still something competitive, maybe 40% or something. It's not completely overwhelmed by the population. Why? For backlash to work, there in their case, they need two premises. One premise, they already, without this, they don't have the reason for a backlash. And second is they are willing to backlash. I'm going to challenge both of these premises. They need both to work. Firstly, they already have the reason to backlash. If you're that much conservative, you're already pissed, whether it's a policy or it is something like this. Secondly, Ben Shapiro and people like this have incentive to, to tell people, or everything on the left is extremely bad, you should be against it. So they already have that sentiment. But second thing, I don't think that people are that much willing to backlash. But what do we mean by backlash? They're maybe willing to say that's bad and we are against it, but they're not going to get that much pissed off. They're not going to do anything concretely. They're not going to go on the streets or do anything because people are generally not that much invested into this. You're not going to change your life because of this. Most people do not think all day, is this more liberal or more conservative politics that much important. The most conservative ones are going to be pissed off anyway, but the people who we actually change are not that much into doing into doing those things. Okay, so moving on to our case. What do we tell you? We tell you that it's extremely important to have these social things that only these movements can do. This is really important. While political parties already are doing things for the policies, they are not doing those things because things like advocating for a backlash, canceling something are harder to to get you votes because of the things I already said. It's extremely much easier to do on a policies and do something like this. So this is something that we don't have in society and we need it. Okay, the important thing is, and the CG says, yeah, but a small amount of people can do it anyway. No, we need a lot of people. When you say a lot of people, what my partner told you is that we don't need completely to change society. We don't need 60% of population to help us. But it doesn't mean that that a movement doing it 1% of the time is enough. No, for canceling and for stuff like this, you need to have persistently canceling things and doing something, persistently helping people. But secondly, when you want to help people on the ground, you need to do it in a variety of places. If you have small amount of people, you're only doing it on a small amount. Okay, PI from DOJ.
BLM creates policy change in police brutality. Without them, change won't happen. CO gets little benefits from little activists. We show an effective, non-antagonizing protest that actually works.
No. We are not getting from little change from little activists. On your side of the house, you have little activists, and all of them is doing the policies that are already done. On our side of the house, all of the activists, all of the movements is doing what we want them to do, is to actually help people, is to actually change the media, is to actually change how people perceive things, to point out, to make pressure to companies to make their employees better and to do all of these things. If a CEO in most of the companies now cannot exploit their workers, that's enough for us. That's what we bring, and we think it's extremely important. When you change the focus from this to policies that are already being changed, you lose the momentum for this. You lose the momentum to actually make a pressure to companies, to canceling, and to society. The only thing we say, we don't need to completely gain the power of society to actually vote to different things. We don't need to actually change the legislature. We only need to pressure society enough so that they behave differently when they go out and that they're not likely to actually do bad things. For all these reasons, see you.
I'd like to thank the opposition for that by speech, indeed all speakers for what was a fine debate. Another round of applause to all speakers for making it to the ESL semi-finals. At this point, I would like to invite you all to please leave the room so the panel can deliberate, and if the recording could also be stopped at this point, that would be great.